Hello and welcome to Bertha's Books. This is the very first episode of Bertha's Books. It was previously called Bertha's World. I still have that. It's my author newsletter, and if you want to check that out, please take a look in the notes below and sign up for the Bertha's World newsletter. But this is the second season, if you like, that follows on from Bertha's World on my YouTube channel, and it's called Bertha's Books, something for readers, something for writers. So I've given it that byline name because half of this program will be about something for readers, really from a reader's point of view. The second one is for writers, about some writing techniques. So before we begin, I just want to thank Lisha Rajju, who is recording this and who will be doing the editing for Bertha's Books. Thank you so much, Lisha. So what we're going to be covering in these episodes, I've chosen out a selection of books just to show you the range and the diversity of the books that I'm going to be talking about so that you can get a sense of whether this interests you or not. So the one I'm just about finished with is Madame Bovary, and that we're going to be talking about next time. But it really is a cracker, and I'm looking forward to telling you about that. So that's a real classic. I've also read The Savage Garden by Mark Mills. It's a more contemporary sort of mystery kind of, a little bit crime thriller, if you like. And I'll tell you about that. There's one thing, well, before I get onto these, let me tell you about, well, this is Umberto Eco. I've actually read this book already, The Prague Cemetery. So I'll be telling you about that. It's really, I suppose, more academic kind of fiction, but well, it's Umberto Eco. You'll see what I mean when we get round to doing it. I've also chosen some crime horror books, not because it's really my thing, but I have a feeling that in a couple of years' time, I'm going to try my hand at something more crime mystery kind of writing. So I've selected a few. I've read Thomas Harris, The Red Dragon, and Silence of the Lambs, which are, of course, real classics. They're absolutely wonderful. But I've also chosen two. One is Birdman, you might know it, by Mo Hader. And then I've chosen something called Exquisite Corpse. This really does sound horror, disturbing book kind of genre. I've started to have a look at it. I'm not exactly sure it's going to be my kind of thing to include here, but let's have a look, and when we come to that, we'll decide. I've also got Joseph Conrad. We'll be talking about Victory once I've read this in the future. And then Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway said that Mark Twain, there's nothing been as good as him before and nothing since in American literature. And I've never read Mark Twain, so I thought I better get this under my belt. And something I'm feeling a bit daunted about is Dostoevsky, the Karamazov brothers. So I've not read, in fact, I've not read much of the Russian authors at all, except Gogol. I've not read Dostoevsky. This is a meaty book. I'm slightly nervous about getting through it, but we'll get to that. And these are the kinds of books that I'm going to be telling you about in this program. So what are we talking about today? So the first one I've got lined up for you that I've read is The Old Man and the Sea, Ernest Hemingway. And I recently saw a one-man show of Hemingway's life and the books he wrote. And, well, he's a complex guy and complexed guy. Yeah, that was just interesting to know more about his life. This was after I read The Old Man and the Sea. What I can tell you is that it's just an absolutely terrific book. It's very short. I think it's novella length, 25,000 words. And anybody who's interested in reading, you can't go wrong with this. It's an absolute gem. So what's it about? It tells the story of Santiago and his friend, who's a young boy. And it's really vintage Hemingway in that it's simple, it's minimalist, and nothing complicated about it. He had a particular writing technique, but we don't need to go into that now. Anyway, there are parts that what the story is about is, so Santiago is an older man He lives the life of a very simple fisherman, and he's gone 80 something days without catching a fish. So the boy who used to go fishing with him, his parents have barred him, have prohibited him from going fishing with Santiago because they believe he's so unlucky and the bad luck's going to rub off on their son and he'll never catch anything. So Santiago starts to go out fishing by himself. And he eventually does catch a fish. So he, in fact, catches an enormous marlin, and much of the book is around him trying to catch the marlin. So he fishes with just a line and a hook and his bare hands. He's got a small boat, and he really wrestles and struggles with a fish over, I think, 2 or 3 days. Anyway, he finally catches the fish, and the fish is too big to get onto his skiff. So he ties the fish to the side of his boat, and on his way back to Cuba, Havana, these sharks are attracted by the smell of the blood in the water, and of course they attack the fish. And despite his desperate attempts and efforts to fight them off, the sharks devour the fish, the marlin, and all that's left by the time he gets back to shore is the skeleton. And that's essentially the story. But there's some things about it that I think readers will love. So firstly, it's a beautifully written story. I can't speak about it highly enough. It actually had quite a profound effect on me when I first read it. It was perhaps something to do with the context of my life at the time, but it's a terrific story. And there are so many beautiful parts to it. So there's one part, I've copied down 2 parts for you over here. So there's one part in which Hemingway is speaking about how the old man, how his shack looks inside. And there's one part where he's referring to the pictures on the walls of his hut or his shack, some of which he had taken down. And it's written that these were taken down, these were relics of his wife. Once there had been a tinted photograph of his wife on the wall, but he had taken it down because it made him too lonely to see, and it was on the shelf in the corner under his clean shirt. So that's really vintage Hemingway. It's beautifully written because it's so simple and there's so much crammed into that short description. You know, he doesn't say too much. He says it very simply. He just says he took the photo down because it made him too sad and too lonely. And then when I read that he put it on the shelf in the corner under his clean shirt, you know, there's so much in these sentences. He put it under his clean shirt. There's one clean shirt. That says so much in itself. You know, I was really touched by so many phrases, so many sentences like this. And then there's another part at the end of the book. So what happens is the skeleton of the marlin is eventually just flopping around in the waves on the beach. And at the very end, you really feel sorry for Santiago, and particularly, I think, because he doesn't express his sadness. He doesn't express his disappointment. So, and that's one of the reasons why the reader sort of takes on these feelings. Anyway, there are 2 tourists who are walking along the beach, and they see the skeleton, and the woman asks the waiter and says, "What type of fish is that?" I think she's American, and the waiter, of course, is Cuban. And he tries to communicate with her, and he's trying to explain to her that this was a marlin and that the sharks had eaten the marlin, and she misunderstands him. She thinks he's saying it's the skeleton of a shark. And he doesn't understand what she's saying, so he just says, yes, it is. So she says, "Oh, gosh, I didn't realize that sharks had such beautifully large bones in their tails." She says to her husband, "Did you know that?" And he says, no, I didn't. It's amazing. Anyway, and they just walk off. And that really is the cherry on the top in this book, because, you know, there's something about that tells you the whole story is quite sad without telling you it's sad. And then nobody is even there to witness the disappointment of this. The people who do learn about it get it all wrong, and that just makes it doubly sad. but that's just the story. And on one hand, just the story on its own is just a cracking good read, but there does feel something allegorical about it. I'm not entirely sure what it is. It feels a bit like a parable, if you've ever read parables. And I think there is something much more fundamental in the story that really you can, when you read it, is something for you to decide about yourself. I've got my own ideas about it, but I don't really need to share those, I suppose. You can make up your own mind when you read it. Perhaps what I can say, I read a few things about The Old Man and the Sea after I read this book, and then after I saw the one-man show of Hemingway. And I think sometimes, as with so much literature, especially when it's good literature like this, people can sometimes overthink it. So I read one review where the narrator is speaking about the story of the old man and the sea, and Santiago being a Christ-like figure, and they make references to when he's catching the fish that his hands are cut by the nylon fishing line, and there's bleeding in his hands. Make references to things like the stigmata, and also Santiago's hero is Joe DiMaggio, and Joe DiMaggio had something apparently wrong with his feet or his heel, and the narrator goes on to speak about references to Genesis, and there's some very well-known biblical quotes related to the suffering of the Christ and in the hands and the feet, of course. But for me, I think sometimes one can just overthink these things. I don't think that's what Hemingway was talking about at all. It just is a good story, and it's sort of allegorical, and that's that. Okay, we're going to go on something for writers. So if you're a writer and you've just tuned into this part of this YouTube video, we're going to be talking about a lot of different styles of writing. And this is really, when I talk about this, I'm really talking about it from my own experience, saying what I think works for me, what I think doesn't work, what I think is useful for me to invest my time and money in as I try to become a better writer. And what I've learned from these particular books that I discuss first, what I've learned from the writing in those books. If you're a writer and you read differently than when you're just a reader. Because as we know, as I know, you probably know as well if you're a writer, is that you can do lots of things to hone your craft and try to get going and so on, but there are two things that are essential. The rest are all just might work for you, might not work for you. The two things that I think are essential is reading and writing. So you've got to just read an awful amount, and you've got to just write an awful amount, and that's the best way to get going and to get your craft honed. The rest of the stuff, postgraduate study, all of that, it might work, it might not. Now, when one does go to a lot of creative writing schools, they'll start off by giving you a lot of rules, and they'll tell you that there are, these are handy rules. Of course, you can break the rules, and you don't always need to follow them, and you can make up your own things, but they often get you to practice a lot of these rules. I don't know if all of them are helpful. And I'm not mad about all of them. I think it's important to know sometimes about them, but there is one particular rule that I am really keen on, because I think it is something that you need to be able to do at some point. And that is the show, don't tell rule, sometimes called, well, I wrote it down here, describe, don't explain. So I think this is a very important one. It is something that you really need to be able to do, because firstly, intuitively, when you start writing, you tend to want to tell or explain. And that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make. So this is a rule, whether Hemingway knew it or not, whether that was in his consciousness when he wrote these things. I somehow don't think so. He was a journalist. I don't think this was part of his learning. I'm sure he knew about it, but I don't think it was part of his learning. But my word, part of what makes The Old Man and the Sea so exceptionally good is it is an excellent, excellent example of show, don't tell, or describe, don't explain. Because what happens when you do that is that if you're telling things, if you're explaining things, you rob the reader of the experience to some degree of feeling those things that the protagonist is feeling. You're sort of almost telling them what it's like to be like that. And the experience, the feeling doesn't bubble up inside themselves over time, and you rob them of what can be a very pleasurable experience when they read the book. That's a big thing. I mean, that's the whole story in one way, but it also happens at the line-by-line sentence. And one thing that I do when I write, so certainly when you read Hemingway, you can learn a lot about that when you read what he's got to say. And one thing that I do is when I do recap after writing, I specifically go and look for places where I have done this and see, is it important that I leave that in? And unless I can really justify using the word, for example, like felt or feel, when the postman arrived, he felt nervous or anxious about whatever, I really take that out. I just take out those words, those lines entirely, unless there's a good reason to leave them in. And that kind of skill is just on display in heaps in The Old Man and the Sea. So that is something for readers, something for writers. I really hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to be coming to you every 3 to 4 weeks with a book that I have read and something that I have learned about the writing from that book. And I hope that whether you're a reader or a writer, or both, if you're a writer, that you will find some of this useful. Thank you. Until next time. Bye.